I'm going to run through some objections here. So you can think of them as sort of increasing in their strength. This first objection is not very good, and there's a good reply to it on behalf of the argument from contingency. So one of the benefits of this argument and the way it's structured is that it gives the theist a nice and I think pretty clean reply to a common objection you hear to cosmological arguments, which is the so-called "what caused God" objection. So some of you may have heard something like this. I think you hear it a lot online. It's like, oh yeah, well, what caused God? As if there is no answer, and that the fact that there is no answer is itself a problem for the theist. This argument, though, shows us why that's mistaken. I'm going to go through the details in a second. Two other objections that are stronger. Objection 2 is potential counterexamples to the PSR, and then objection 3 is Hume's objection. So let's start with this "what caused God" objection. The natural reply from the theist is going to be, well, God has no cause, right? And the original objector, the defender of objection 1, is going to say, aha, this is the point of the "what caused God" question. It's not merely a rhetorical question. It's supposed to be revealing a problem. And the follow-up from the objector will be, that's cheating, right? You accepted the PSR, that everything has a cause. And now you're saying, the universe has a cause, but I'm going to make a special exception for God, right? Like, God gets this special no-cause hall pass that nothing else does. And that feels like cheating, right? It's a kind of God of the gaps problem. If the theist is being careful, they have a good reply to this. They're going to say, like, look, the PSR does not say that everything has a cause. That's a misstatement of the PSR. The PSR, the version that I'm using in my argument, just says that every contingent being has a cause. And that's not just like an, ad hoc, unprincipled thing that I'm doing. I'm not just reaching for whatever principle will help me. No, there's a reason why I'm restricting causes to contingent beings. And the reason is that contingent beings exist but didn't have to. And as such, there has to be some reason outside of them that should explain why they do rather than don't. But necessary beings, if there are any, aren't like that. Necessary beings are such that they exist, and they would have existed no matter what. There's not like another option for a necessary being. It exists, and it had to. So to ask, like, what caused a necessary being to exist is a mistake. It's just a mistaken question. There's no problem here for the theist. If anything, if you're asking what caused a necessary being to exist, you don't understand the category of a necessary being, is another way to put it. So this is the sort of second way to put it. The first way to put the theist response is to draw our attention back to what the PSR actually says. The second way to understand what they're doing is to forget the PSR for a second, just think about the difference between contingent and necessary beings. Asking for the cause of a necessary being is a category mistake, so says the theist. It's like asking what caused 2 + 2 to be 4. The right response to such a question is to point out that that's the way things had to be. There wasn't another way for things to have gone. And if you don't like that, you may think, well, I agree that there's a necessary being, but I don't think it's God. That's fine. But you could also say, I reject one of the premises of your argument to get me to the conclusion that there's a necessary being. Also fine. But what's not a good objection is to say, all right, sure, you've proven that there is this necessary being and that it's God, but what caused God? It's just not a good objection. Here's a better objection. The argument itself, of course, relies on the principle of sufficient reason. So if the principle of sufficient reason is false, in other words, if it has counterexamples, or instances of beings that don't obey the principle, then we can't rely on it in any argument. So right down there at 2.3, there's the PSR. If it turns out the PSR is false, the whole argument falls apart. What you're going to need for a good counterexample of the PSR, there's no uncontroversial ones. Every one of these is very controversial. You need an example of an actual or perhaps merely possible, at the very least logically coherent example of a being that is contingent and that has no cause outside of itself. So this could be something that is a self-caused being, which we had reasons not to like last week, but if there were a contingent self-caused being, that would be a counterexample to the PSR, or an example of something that has no cause whatsoever, inside or outside of itself, and that is contingent. Here are some examples of potential counterexamples to the PSR. I'm going to flag as we go through, like, the details here in each of these cases are really complicated, and we didn't talk about them in class, but I think they're worth keeping in mind for you to think about for your future edification. Some people think that there are experimental results in quantum mechanics that suggest the existence of a contingent event or a contingent fact that has no cause. The famous kinds of experiments in quantum physics are the firing of a photon through this double slit, and measurements on the other side of the slit suggest that there is either the photon will appear on one side, the right-hand side, or on the left-hand side after it's fired through this slit. But there doesn't seem to be any cause of why it appears in one place rather than another. Instead, it seems to be completely indeterminate what the location of this photon is. Other versions of the experiment seem to suggest that the photon state as either an entity or an individual or a wave, a particle or a wave, is something that is indeterminate and lacks a cause. The main problem with this example, quantum mechanics is like famously subject to all kinds of different interpretations. There are interpretations of the data that are deterministic and that obey the PSR. I think they're not as popular as the indeterministic ones, but like they are interpretations of the data. You can't read this right off of the experiment. But I think more relevant here is that our version of the PSR that we formulated is in terms of beings, and it's not clear that the location of a particle is a being. The particle is a being, but it's whether it's located here or there seems more like a state or an event or a fact. And we got into a discussion about this briefly in class. So at least arguably the version of the PSR that I've set up here, framed in terms of beings, isn't susceptible to counterexamples involving these kinds of experiments, whereas you saw that Rowe's version, which is framed in terms of facts, may be susceptible to these kinds of examples. Something similar can be said about, you'll sometimes hear people say that like free choices, undetermined, unconstrained, free human decisions, if indeed they exist, which we will discuss later, might be counterexamples to the PSR. My decision to have Cheerios for breakfast this morning rather than Pop-Tarts seems like completely a free decision on my part. Nothing constrained or caused me to decide to have one rather than the other. It also seems contingent. I could have chosen otherwise. Maybe that's an example of something that is both lacking a cause and such that it's contingent. But again, there's the worry here that my decision isn't really a being. It's more like an event or a fact. I'm a being, but my decision isn't like a little individual of any sort. Instead, it's a fact about me. So free human decisions, if those do exist, if they're contingent, and if they're uncaused, will be counterexamples to Rowe's formulation of the PSR, but probably not the one that I've formulated here. Another potential example that I'll let you think about for yourself is so-called backwards causation or self-causation that occurs via time travel. So like famous Terminator-style thought experiments, fictions involving someone who goes back in time and kills their grandfather, or goes back in time and, like in Back to the Future, sleeps with their grandmother or mother or whatever, or, grandfather, I suppose, whatever. I don't know how this is supposed to work, but the details here aren't super important. The idea is there doesn't seem to be, given what we know about general relativity, there doesn't seem to be any in principle logical barrier to the idea of time travel. And once you introduce the possibility of time travel, you might have potential possible examples of self-caused beings, and they might be like you and me, not like gods or something, but like beings that go back in time and cause themselves to exist, or not, depending on what you do back in time. All of those, as you've seen, are complicated, super controversial, and not at all straightforward. And so you may very well think that there are better examples, or you may think that one or more of these are good counterexamples to the PSR. But I'll just caution you that to work through the details if you're interested in any of these on your own. I mean, we'll talk a lot more about the free will case later on, but this is part of why the PSR and this particular version of it has been attractive throughout history, because even if there are examples that show it's false, they are not so straightforward, and there are problems, and most people don't accept, most philosophers and physicists and so on don't accept these interpretations of the data. So it's really up for grabs. All you need is one, though, and that's the important thing, is if you can get one counterexample to the PSR, boom, the whole argument falls apart. But you need a counterexample that your opponent can agree to. Finally, this should say objection 3. Hume's objection. We didn't read Hume, but Rowe gave you a kind of preview of it, or an overview of Hume's objection in the piece. Here's the basic idea. So Hume, you can think of Hume's objection as making sort of 3 distinct but interrelated claims. First, Hume and those in Hume's tradition will say the universe is infinitely long in the past. And so collection C is infinite. In other words, there's an infinite series of efficient causes. One contingent being is preceded by another and another and another, each of which brings the other into existence ad infinitum. As we saw, all by itself, the defender of the contingency argument is going to be like, okay, fine, I didn't say there couldn't be. I still think, though, that there must be something outside the series that caused it to exist. What caused all of them to be, rather than not be? And this is where the defender of the Humean objection, Hume's objection, is going to add their second claim. They're going to say, look, the only reason that you thought that there had to be something outside of this infinitely long collection is that you mistakenly thought there was an additional being, collection C, that had as its parts each of the contingent things that exists. But that's a mistake. Yes, we can refer to all of the infinitely many contingent things there are. We can even give it a name if we want to, collection C, but we haven't thereby brought into existence, another contingent being that, has, just as I have hands and feet as a part, that has like planets and me and you and every other contingent being as its parts, right? There's not. This is a fiction, a way of more easily discussing a mere grouping of things. It's as if I threw a bunch of grains of sand on the floor and then tried to say that in addition to all of those grains of sand, there was another thing, capital G, grain, that had all of the individual grains of sand as its parts. That would be a mistake. There's not another thing there. Once you count up the grains of sand, you've counted all the things there are. There's not, in addition, a whole that's composed of them. That is the move that Hume's going to make. So Hume's going to say, like, look, I just reject this first premise. This is a reifying or making real of something that isn't itself its own being. And then secondly, for that reason, I don't think that collection C is itself contingent, because I don't think collection C is anything other than just contingent thing 1, contingent thing 2, contingent thing 3, contingent thing 4, and so on. Finally, the Humean is going to add this last point. The PSR is true, or for all I say, sure, let's bring on the PSR. Why not? But that doesn't mean that there's something outside of all of the contingent things, because the PSR is perfectly satisfied so long as each individual contingent thing that there is has a cause outside of itself. And if we go back to our infinite series, indeed, each and every thing in the cause in the series has a cause outside of itself. There's no contingent thing that lacks a cause. And don't tell me that there's this thing called collection C. There isn't such a thing. There's just thing 1, thing 2, thing 3, thing 4. Each of them has a cause. Each of them is contingent. So the PSR, sure, it's true. But because I don't think that there's any additional being over and above them, I don't think there has to be anything outside of them that bring them all into existence. A final way of putting this is that once you have explained each individual member of the series of contingent things, whether it's finite or infinite in length, you've thereby explained why all of them exist. There's not a separate question of, yeah, but why are there any? Like, no, I've explained why each of them exists. That's all there is to explain. PSR is true. What more do you want from me? That's Hume's objection. All right, we're going to stop there, and we're going to pick up with the argument from evil on Monday. I will see you then.